I'm a manager from the UK, and I have a reasonable amount of experience in rights and copyrights, and there's a lot of jargon in the music industry that gets misused a lot of the time. At the moment in Brussels, there's a pan-European copyright reform process going on that could dramatically affect the way platforms like YouTube use and share music. It might then affect artists and the way they engage with audiences. Underneath all of that is copyright. I'm going to dive deep into music publishing, which is a kind of scary area. And when I started out as a manager, I could sort of understand what live was, and I certainly knew what records was. I'd bought enough records, I knew what a record label was, and I could even imagine myself being a record label or putting a show on or being a tour manager. But the publishing thing was this really weird thing. And a question that you get a lot as a manager from younger managers or artists starting out is, how do I get a publisher? Do I need a publisher? Publishing is basically administration. You're paying somebody to do an admin job for you. There's another element of publishing which is creative, and a lot of the publishing deals that people do, they're just, the reason I think a lot of people sign publishing deals is they don't know what publishing is. So we're going to really go through nuts and bolts on publishing, and then we'll be a bit more flexible and a bit more open on some of the other topics. So this slide is just to sort of symbolize, this slide even, that the old business model collapsed, that everything fell apart from how things were done 25 years ago. Music publishing is really old. It's from the printing press. It's from developing ways of sharing and distributing compositions and lyrics. That's the piece of the music industry that's maybe been the least disrupted by digital. So everything's fallen apart. It's up to you guys now to rearrange the blocks in a new business model. Maybe we'll talk a bit later today or tomorrow about voice activation, about people having smart speakers in their homes and saying, hey, play me this, play me that, and what that means for artists and how you want to work with that. So I very much feel that the whole industry is up for grabs at the moment. It's up to you guys, particularly the younger generation, to reshape it and build it. You have this opportunity. Publishing is the area that's most ripe for disruption. It's the area that people know the least about. It should go sort of somehow into the future, into the space age. It's incredibly backwards at the moment. So to recap, one, people are really scared and mystified of publishing, and they're like, hey, how do I get a publisher? And they push the responsibility of publishing off onto publishers. And two, it's a mess. It needs reforming. It needs to be brought into the future. So with copyrights, when you have the word copyright literally means the permission, the right to make copies. So the first copyright rules came up in about 1650 in the UK, and it was permission, as printing presses started to develop, it was permission from the owner of the content, so the text, let's say it's a book, for somebody to make copies of them. And the person who would be a publisher was the person who was literally printing copies of the book. So the concept of publishing comes out of books, plays, legal documents, and then was very easily adapted to music. Artists like Mozart and Beethoven were pretty soon being published so that their music could be shared around more orchestras so more people could play it. What you've got to think of within music is that the publishing right and the performance right are kind of two separate things. So the performance right, let's use the Beatles as a really simple example. The Beatles is a band. There's 4 people in that band. There's John, Paul, Ringo and George, and they get up on stage and they perform. Sometimes they're singing their own songs that they wrote themselves. Sometimes they're singing songs written by Little Richard. Sometimes they're singing Elvis songs. They're singing all sorts of songs, but they're performing them specifically. So if you go on stage and make a noise, that's a performance. If you go into a recording studio and make a noise, that's a performance. So the right in the performance is not the same as the publishing rights. Publishing rights, it's shorthand, English jargon publishing. It's the wrong label, it's the wrong word. Live is the correct word for the live industry. Publishing is the wrong word for the publishing industry because it's outmoded. So really what we should be talking about is composition and lyrics rights. So the copyright, someone's got a printing press, they're making copies. They're making copies of Beethoven wrote a symphony, he wrote the Ninth Symphony, he wrote all of the notes, the lyrics, the composition, and there's some words in the Ninth, there's a choir at the end, so there's lyrics there as well. The words and the music, the composition and the lyrics is a set of rights, and it has in it the copyright, because it's very similar, it's basically the same thing as if you wrote a book or you wrote a play or you wrote something down. You can write down the composition and the lyrics. So book publishing, music publishing, the copyright is the underlying right, this red triangle here that everything's based on. So the Beatles is a performance of songs, compositions and lyrics by somebody else, maybe by them. What happened with the Beatles was two members of that band, Lennon and McCartney, started writing a lot of the songs. So if you think with the Beatles, the composition and lyrics is Lennon and McCartney, the performance is John, Paul, Ringo and George. They come together, they're two separate things. Generally the record company, if it's a performance in a recording studio and somebody has paid for it, that person's the record company. They own those performance rights, and generally whoever's got the permission from the author to make copies of the composition and lyrics owns those rights. There isn't really a copyright in the performance. There's a copyright in the composition and lyrics. There's related rights or neighbouring rights in the performance. So when people talk about copyright, they often mean everything. They mean the performance that was on the recording, they mean the composition, the lyrics, and it gets really confusing. There's two simple elements. There's the Lennon and McCartney bit and the John, Paul, Ringo and George bit. And they sometimes come together. Like if your band covers a song that was written by Lennon and McCartney, then Lennon and McCartney would own the composition and lyrics and you guys would own the performance, or if you'd signed to a record label, or if you did it on stage and you sold tickets for it, it's still a performance. The piece of jargon that gets really confusing is within the composition and lyrics, there is a performing right. So that's a fee that would be paid to whoever owns the composition and lyrics for the right to perform it. So when it gets played on radio, a song, let's say there's a Beatles record is played on the radio, the music that you're listening to, you're hearing the two component rights. You're hearing the performance rights and the copyright, which is the music publishing, the composition and lyrics. And there is permission has gone from the owner of the composition and lyrics to the performers or their record label for permission to perform it. So the second set has to pay the first set for permission. So John, Paul, Ringo and George are paying Lennon and McCartney for the right to perform their compositions and lyrics. It's complicated, but those two pieces come together. And as an artist manager, if your artist writes their own stuff, you have to be across all of these rights, but you have to try and separate off in your head the composition and lyrics. Because if you're fortunate, what will happen is other artists will start to cover those songs, other uses will be, and then people will start to pay you for the right to perform. You'll get a phone call from Adele, hey, we want to record this song, and she'll have to pay you for that usage, or her record company will. The copyright's a weird concept. So this is a photograph of a public building, and it's a very old building. And my question to any of you is do you think there's copyright in the photograph? Not in the building, but like, so if I came here, and because there's a public crowd here, if I was at home singing Lennon and McCartney songs, I wouldn't have to pay a public performance right. But in front of you guys, a crowd, I should be paying a public performance right for singing Lennon and McCartney songs. So I'm now showing you guys a picture that can be printed on a printing press. So do we think there might be copyright? It's hard to say. So on this one, is there copyright?
Should be. But someone also designed the lights there.
So he's absolutely nailed it. So on the first one, the copyright, the length that the government gives for the author, the rights holder in that image, so in this case with the Eiffel Tower, it's the architect, the copyright expired on the for the architect. So after a period of time, Lennon and McCartney's songs, you'll no longer have to pay to play them. You no longer have to pay to play Beethoven. At some point it will expire for Lennon and McCartney.
And the deadline is 75 years?
It's the life of the author plus 70 years. So Lennon's dead. The day McCartney dies, all his family will be like counting down, we've got 70 years left of the money. So the copyright expired on the Eiffel Tower, and then you're exactly right, the copyright in the lighting design has not expired. In France, there's a copyright in panoramas. So you take a public photograph of a public space, the architect has copyright in that. If you, as a newspaper, published that picture, you'd have to pay copyright to the owner of the lighting design for the lights on the Eiffel Tower. So this runs into all sorts of entanglements where it's really hard for the consumer, the ordinary person in the street, to know when they should or should not use copyright. It's also really hard for an author. So in music, if we call the author the person who wrote either the composition or the lyrics, and we call the performer the person who's playing them, so Lennon and McCartney are authors, it's really hard for the authors to know. They sort of have a concept that they've got copyright, but who should pay them? When should someone be granted permission? So this is one of the reasons that authors and their managers will often just give the stuff to publishers, because it's so weird how it works and how it's evolved. But be really sure that most publishers don't know how it goes on, how it's evolved. What you'll find with a lot of publishers is that they use a sub-publisher. So what would happen is, let's say there's a company in Prague that is a publishing company, and they say to you guys, hey, we can represent you around the world, we can make sure all your stuff is correctly registered, sign a contract with us, we'll collect all the money for you, we'll take care of all the permissions, and we'll give the money back to you. We have global networks, a global representation. Often what they're doing is they're not carrying out the job of registering everything with the collection societies, of checking all the uses, of finding out how much they should license. They're often just building up a big catalogue of copyrights, of rights, songs and compositions from various authors, and then they're giving them to a full-time company that's maybe in Germany or the United States that's just doing this on a massive scale globally. The sub-publisher, therefore, is often the company that's doing most of the work for you, and the publisher isn't always doing the work. So if you have a conversation with the publisher about, hey, we'll sign a publishing deal, and then you're all excited, hey, we signed a publishing deal, be really careful, because your publisher might not be properly involved in the business side, in the management of copyrights, knowing where and when to claim for uses. I'm just going to skip out of this there and go into some really dry stuff. With this publishing stuff as well, I'll run through basically how the whole industry works. And if you've got questions while I'm talking, throw them in while I'm talking, because there's layer upon layer of this, and if we try and come back to stuff at the end, you might forget your question. So go for it.
Isn't it better than like to have someone big, sub-publisher that do it on a massive scale, to have then rather some small, publishing company that don't know really how to...
Did everyone, can you hear that at the back? Did everyone hear that? Yeah. So the choice is between a big professional company that does all this stuff versus a small company. For me, every case is different, but yes, if you could find a big, powerful, globally connected company with lots of staff, with offices in many countries, they're likely to do a much better job for you than if you give it to a small company that then passes it on to the big company or tries to do it themselves.
It's pretty easy in these days. Like, what do you think about CD Baby Publishing and SoundExchange?
So SoundExchange is on the master rights, is on the recording side. and CD Baby will offer that service for you. They're a distributor. I think increasingly there are good opportunities. I personally, so this is not the IMMF speaking, just me personally, Song Trust and Downtown Publishing from the United States, if you Google Song Trust, all one word, they're probably at the cutting edge of really trying to create a new business model. There's a company called Cobalt who become very famous, but essentially, if you ask me, again, and speaking personally, not on behalf of the International Music Managers Forum, what Cobalt did was they changed the user interface. So what I was saying earlier on with the picture of the satellites and saying everything collapsed, nobody's yet disrupted music publishing. And there's a few companies out there who are getting credit for it, and everyone's like, this is the new publishing model, they've changed everything. When I say the user interface, what I mean is, if you were Lennon and McCartney, you would be getting massive printed sheets of micro payments coming out of Slovenia, some amount from Indonesia, this for a radio station in Sydney, Australia, that for a cover version of in a nightclub in the north of England, and you'd have to piece it all together.
Like if they're honest enough, right?
Very hard for them to track it. Yeah.
Like is it usually based on the ISRC?
We'll
codes,
come into
or?
that. That's a
Yeah.
great
Okay.
question. So the change of the user interface was basically what companies like Cobalt and then BMG, which is a very big publishing company, which I also think they're quite good, BMG, they started to just create online 24-hour logins, so that instead of getting these massive printed statements once every blue moon, you could go in and check the stuff. So the user experience, the user interface completely changed. But then in the background, this question here is like, how do they know this is real? None of that changed, but there was a general perception, particularly within the industry media, that it had all changed, because they'd see these presentations from these big companies who'd raised a lot of investment, and the presentation would be like, we've bought a new face on publishing, and we're doing this, it's amazing. And everyone was like, that's great, have some more beer, lovely. And then they'd say who they'd signed, because they were doing deals where they would drop the fee that they would charge. So typical fees before this change on the user interface happened, which happened maybe 10 to 15 years ago, typical fees in music publishing is a publisher would charge you, let's say you are the author, and let's say you wrote everything, there's no other authors on this track, so 100% of the money belongs to you. If you do not appoint a publisher, 100% of the money still belongs to you. If you appoint a publisher, it's an agreement to give them a percentage of whatever they collect for you in return for their service of collecting the money for you. So the typical percentages would be sort of 20 to 30%, sometimes even higher. When these companies 15 years ago started saying there's digital and we can now give you your statements online, they typically dropped the prices because managers, lawyers, accountants on behalf of artists had long-term, like 50, 100-year relationships with big publishing companies, because publishing is really old. Live music is the oldest part of the music industry, but publishing relative to, say, the recording industry is really old. So in order to drag authors away from the established relationships with the big publishing companies, they started dropping the prices. So it wasn't unusual 5 to 10 years ago to suddenly be offered a big publishing deal at a rate where the publisher would keep like 5 to 7% of the money. The prices have started going back up again because it's unsustainable. It is sustainable on a big artist like a Lennon and McCartney. You could charge 1% and still make money. Back in the 70s, when interest rates were really high, they were like 8 to 10%. The company that published Pink Floyd used to do it for 0%, because it would take them 18 months to pay the money out, so they would earn 8% on Pink Floyd's money for 18 months. So the prices have started to go back up on publishing, but as I say, it has not been disrupted. There's a lot of talk about it, a lot of modern ways. So part of coming together as a community and discussing things, hey, who's got a good publishing deal? The key to it is to do short-term deals. So if you sign a publishing agreement, make sure it's for the short term.
Yeah, I have a question for
Yeah.
maybe a little more for advice, and I hope others can benefit from that.
Great.
So I'm about releasing a first EP concurrency of the CD Baby, right? From
Yes.
Online. So I'm just wondering if you have any experiences with that, or like would you recommend it or not? Because I
So
don't really
if
know
we
that.
go back to the two
First
slides,
question, are you protected? Did you protect your rights as an author? First,
Like with OSA or how?
with anybody? you
Yes,
can
with
protect-
OSA.
I'm with OSA, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, okay.
so with the slides that I had up, I've taken them down so I could read some notes. With the slides that I had up, there was a red triangle and a blue triangle. What you're talking about is the blue triangle. So although you said to publish them and you said Believe is a company that will help you, as you correctly said, publish, release stuff, put it on the internet, put it onto Spotify, put it onto YouTube. They're not taking care, Believe as a company, of the author's rights and the composition rights. They're just taking care of what's known as the master rights, which was that blue bit, the performer. It's John, Paul, Ringo and George. And in the old model, John, Paul, Ringo and George would always sign to a record company. Their record company was EMI. The master recording, the one from which all of the, I hesitate to use the word copy because it will get confused with the author's rights, which is copyright. The master rights is a related right, a neighbouring right. Those rights, that's what you're talking about, and we'll come on to that later on, is the different routes you've got to market between, say, TuneCore, CD Baby, Believe. In terms of protecting yourself as the author, so you've either written the composition or the lyrics or both, or you have a percentage of that, registering with OSA is exactly the right thing to do. It's probably the only thing you really can do. What used to happen was you would be advised, if you thought it was going to be a really valuable song, is to get a printed copy of the sheet music, put it in an envelope, seal it up, get it stamped and registered by the post office and have it sent to a lawyer, and then the lawyer would not open the envelope, because then if at some point somebody came up with a copy of your song, you could prove, because you had this registered letter in a lawyer's office, on what date you'd registered effectively the song. So copyright exists at the moment where you wrote the thing. It exists without formality. So with property, if you build a house, you need to register it, and you don't own it unless you've claimed it and registered it and bought the land. With copyright, it just exists. So registering it with OSA and sending stuff to your lawyer is a way of protecting yourself, but it just exists off the bat in you having it. So it's important that you then take steps to register it.
And what is the major difference if you put some song on YouTube or lyrics for Facebook or whatever, and you are the first to put it, it's yours?
It's yours. Yep.
It's making copyright as well, or what is the difference?
It makes a big problem actually. It happened to me that someone put up our music through TuneCore actually.
Put the lyrics up,
Yeah,
or the...
I'm like 1 year talking to them to put it down that it's ours, and you have to claim it. Fuck, you have to claim it. You have nothing.
Yeah.
You have nothing signed, you know, but...
So the lyrics you're talking
They
about.
were first.
But did they TuneCore, did you contact them to help
Yeah.
you? And what did they say to TuneCore?
I have to like connect them with OSA, and it's like big.
And what platform were the lyrics showing on?
They actually put it down from the Spotify and everything. It
Okay.
was doubled. The albums were doubled.
Yep.
But now the YouTube is like.
Yes, it is.
They managed somehow to took over because it was claimed.
Yeah.
But they managed somehow to took over. And it's like.
So this is taking us back to that Eiffel Tower thing. It's like we're really, from being structured and organised, we're into like, how the hell does it work? So just repeat your...
Oh,
What was the example? It was
what is the
YouTube.
difference? If it can be counted as a copyright once you publish some lyrics on the internet with
Yep.
the proper date or whatever.
So it's copyright the moment you wrote the lyrics. The copyright belongs to you. When it's published, if you're putting down the copyright symbol, the C in the little circle, you're identifying yourself as either the owner, or you're putting in little text who the owner is if it's somebody else. So you're acknowledging that who the copyright owner is. But it's a real problem because it just exists. If you write a poem on a card to your mum for her birthday, there's copyright in that, even though you didn't go and register it with OSA or inform YouTube that you'd written this. So taking steps to make sure that you can be recognised as the author is really important. So the local CMO, Collective Management Organisation, which is OSA on the author's side, often called Performing Rights Society. That's kind of the historical jargon. And the problem with Performing Rights Society is they do a lot more than that now. So Performing Rights was, in France, a bunch of music authors and publishers got together because they were regularly sitting in cafes in Paris and hearing bands publicly performing their music. And they were thinking the price of the dinners are quite high in here, and it's because there's nice music in the background. So they couldn't find a way to go to the venue, the cafes, the restaurants to get paid. So they basically formed a collective management organisation, SACEM, which for music authors is the oldest one in the world, which is still the French one, to say we represent these 100, 200, 300, now it's hundreds of thousands of authors, and we are going to give you a license to play any music by our authors in your cafe or your restaurant. So if you do not register it with OSA, it doesn't mean that you don't have the copyright. You do have the copyright. If you do not send your lawyer a letter, you still have the copyright. A simpler way of the lawyer's letter is simply an email with obviously comes with a timestamp.
It happened to me like a year ago that I uploaded a video and it somehow suddenly goes viral, and then somebody downloaded it and uploaded it from their own private account, and I didn't know how to, like, who is supposed to, like,
The short answer with...
I think that is not the one at this moment.
They're not.
And it was not registered, it was just a video.
The reason OSA, so the Authors Collection Society, the reason they're not the ones who are responsible when there's a video of a performance has been uploaded to a platform like YouTube is because that's the master recording. So that's the blue side. So when you go on to I'll come right back to that. So if you take in these French cafes and restaurants that the authors came together, created a collective management organisation for the purposes of licensing the public performance of their music, and then how that ends up is the Beatles play a stadium show in New York and they do 20 songs, and of the 20 songs, 2 of them were written by B.B. King. The stadium is licensed by the American Collective Management Organisation, and they look at this, and the stadium takes some of the ticket money and gives it to the Collective Management Organisation that represents the authors. In the same way as in Paris, the restaurant would pay some money to the Collective Management Organisation that represented the authors. Shea Stadium, they're like, what did you play? Who owns these? Let's pay them. So with Shea Stadium, they're paying, let's say 18 of the songs were written by Lennon and McCartney and 2 of them by B.B. King. So they divide the money up that way. In the French restaurant, they're like, okay, this one was by you, this one was by you wrote that one, and they spread the money out. So the purpose of the collective management organisations is to grant licenses on behalf of a group of authors. You should join your local collective management organisation because they're issuing these collective licenses without your permission, because it's so much easier for large users of music. Correctly, it would be ridiculous if the restaurants in Prague or the radio stations in this country had to then go and find all of you individually and say, hey, can we negotiate how much to play your song? So for ease of use, they negotiate collective licenses for the radio stations, for the big venues, for the festivals, and then all of the authors who are members are covered. The collective management organisation, OSA, for example, here, collects the money. It has a distribution policy that's set by its members, and then it pays that money through after some in-house deductions and costs to the correct authors. If you didn't register, if you haven't properly identified your stuff, you're not going to get paid. Your earlier question with the ISWC, so the music industry is all about the artist, and whenever you go to any discussion, everybody, the festivals, the labels, they're all like, hey, we're here for the artist. It's all about the artist. But nobody gives a shit in the music industry about who the artist is, about identifying them and registering them. So on the author's side, the collection societies and the publishers have registered those tracks because they're getting paid for collecting the money. So they really care not so much about are Lennon and McCartney all right, so much as, hey, that song, I get a piece of that, let's get the money for it. So the whole ecosystem is built on the registration ISWC, International Standard Works Code, works being the composition of the lyrics. It's music jargon, the work, for the underlying composition and lyrics. So the bit that Lennon and McCartney made is the work. The performance of it that's on a recording is the master recording. So the rights in the recording are identified by a tag number called an ISRC, International Standard Recording Code, and in the work, ISWC. So on those two triangles we had, the red triangle is ISWC, the blue one is ISRC. So whenever you create a piece of music, if you were only the composer and the author, you should try and find out the ISWC. I'll come back to how you do that. And if you were the performers or you're the record label, you paid for the recording, you should find out the ISRC. You would do that here, the ISRC with Intergram. If there was no record label who gave you money to make that recording, you just made it yourselves on home equipment, it still deserves an ISRC code. You should get in touch with Intergram and say, hey, I need an ISRC code. What they will do is they will issue a code that's on a global system, and it'll have 2 digits in it, 2 characters in it that will identify this is Czech. So it will say CZ in it, or for myself it will say UK. Then it will have 2 digits for the year, so because the rights in ownership of that start ticking, eventually they're going to run out, so they want to know the year that it was released on. And then it will have a unique code that identifies you as a label, as a record company. Even if you're then going to give it on to TuneCore or sign it to Universal, if you're registering that recording, you have to think of yourselves as a rights owner, a recording company. And then it'll have 4 more digits, which are basically your own internal code. So you could call the first one you put in 0001.
It's like,
There's some fee for that, right? Pretty high for registering with Instagram or this ICRC.
There shouldn't be.
It should be for free.
it's free.
Really?
It has to be free.
It's free, yeah. It's free.
Because this is like the author rights are same as a human rights.
Yeah.
You're like born with it, and the moment you create this
It's
is
given.
Funny thing on this is that Intergram is actually for performers, not the authors, and they are issuing ISRC, which is like it should be OSA doing it by the
So OSA should be doing ISWC, which is the work.
But they don't.
Yeah, they do. And then Intergram will do ISRC, which is the recording.
Yeah.
Okay.
So they're in the right space, OSA.
And also, I forgot this just to advise you, in these days when everything is protected, especially in Western markets, I'm from Croatia, so we are coming from the markets, we don't protect our names and brands. And in life you will come, we had the same issue with a band name. In America there was another band with the same name, we had the similar genre as well. And in one point you will lose your identity or brand if you didn't registrate your name. And it's not with a name, it's not as a human right, as an author right, this is like a marketing right, so anybody can protect the name. And you will have to, it's hard to prove that you did it first 20 years ago. So if somebody has a special, like if it's not your legal name, if you have another name or something, I would even advise when you start a career to protect your name of it just for the future issues of rights.
Is it different if it's your legal name?
Yeah,
You
then,
still should do it anyway.
yeah, you should still do it, but it's then you can prove easier.
Yeah,
But if
yeah.
you like, I'm like Didi, and Facebook now doesn't want me to use my Didi like nickname. Somebody protected my nickname or something like
And
that.
that's also quite important to add actually to your comment, that no matter, for instance, you play to any venue, OSA and Intergram will anyway collect the percentage of your gig. So if you're not signed to this organization, they will collect it and you just don't get the money. So that's also like, that's a basic step by. And then you can decide which society you would like to go. You can go to GEMA, you can go to SASEM, you can go ask someone else as well. But I think it still makes more sense to go to OSA.
So this is free, this music, right? But if you want to protect the brand, it costs, but maybe like €50 or it's not a big one. It can like cost you more in the future. So this is also not a big investment in because we come from different area. We have still discussion. Do we need our rights? Yes, we don't need discussion. We have these rights that are our rights. So we should. I know that collecting society. Jake also knows this, in our area, part of Europe, Central, Southeastern, they are not the best, let's say like this. I will be nice. And they don't work with us as they should. But this is not the reason that we have to call them, use them, and
quick thing on the local quality and variation in quality of the collective management organisations. Here you have
people don't trust them, let's say like this.
You have OSA. In the UK, it's called PRS. In France, it's called SACEM. In Germany, it's called GEMA. Zeiks in Poland. The German one, GEMA, I've actually seen a street protest against them where members of the public, there was a giant dinosaur that had GEMA written on it. Members of the public were running up to punch it because it was deemed that the collective management organisation was charging not the restaurants but the nightclubs too much money for music, and they were going, oh, if we have to pay for music, we'll shut down. In America, they ended up with, because it's all competition, instead of having one single national collective management organisation, they had two, then they had three. It's a bit like the boxing titles. At the moment, there's somewhere around 5, but one of them's really like an elite thing. It's set up by a guy who managed the Eagles, and he's got Pharrell, and they're like, well, we'll pull our stuff out, we'll ask for even more money when we go to the restaurants or the radio stations and things like that. So although there's problems with your collective management organisation and some of the ones in neighbouring countries, there's no countries yet got it right, which comes back to this thing of reform. And then it's really important that you guys come together as a community and imagine what the perfect one would be and annoy the hell out of OSA and Intergram to have meetings with them, workshops, learn more about what they're doing. We were getting quite into the weeds there just now on, so I'm going to do a recap, that there's the author's rights. So we have the performance, which was that's the bit, the blue bit. Let's put in the master right on there. So this is the master recording. That's the record company owns John Paul, Ringo and George's version of a song. The composition and lyrics is the bit that's called the work. That's the bit that music publishing concerns. This is record companies. This is music publishing. Music publishing is connected to OSA. This, record companies, is connected to Intergram. So when somebody uses the stuff, like a YouTube or a radio station, they need both sides. The historical split between the sides is really random. So by the split, I mean for every dollar that gets paid, how is the money divided? How much goes towards the performers and the record labels and the live venues, and how much goes towards the authors, the publishers, and OSA. On a sync deal, which I'll come back to what that is, it's 50-50. On a lot of mechanicals, I'll come back to what that is, it's around 3, 4 to 8% for the author and over 90% for the performer and the record label. I'll drill into what those different bits of the rights are. I won't give them to you now, we'll talk about something else, then we'll come back to that, because it just gets too confusing with all the different things. Composition and lyrics is the work. The performance on the master recording is the record label side. There's always the two of them. You might not own both sides, or you might only have one side. So examples of, so a publisher, we've talked a bit about the collective management organisation, and they license stuff collectively. So a radio station, just like a restaurant, doesn't want to go and find every author. Think of the publisher as the author's agent. So if the author didn't appoint, the author of the song, Lennon McCartney, if they didn't appoint an agent, the publisher, to represent them, they'd have to be fielding the inquiries themselves. So at the point where the user of the music is saying, can I use this music? Can you give me a license? I'll pay you for permission, a license to use your music. The author might have appointed someone to represent them, a publisher, in that conversation. So the role of a publisher is to work on behalf of the author to do things for them. It's a service provider. If you're an author, you don't need a publisher unless you think the publisher is going to do stuff for you and they're going to provide a good service. You can register you have the copyright anyway in the stuff you did. You can go and register those songs with OSA, and then you've got some element of protection. You can keep an eye out for when people are using it, and you can say, hey, that's mine. And you can say to OSA, hey, we're being played on the radio, another band covered the track. Can you make sure you track it? So you would appoint an agent, a publisher, to go and look after this for you. The admin and registration, so you would tell your publisher, hey, we've written this new song, here's the notes, here's the composition, here's the lyrics, take care of it. What the publisher should be then doing is making sure that they have a really good copy of it, making sure maybe that they've got some translations, if there's other languages that you think this might be relevant in. They need to make sure that they know who all the writers were on the track. So if it's Lennon and McCartney, they need to see if Lennon and McCartney have agreed between them who owns what. So if they say, if Lennon says I own the composition and McCartney says I own the lyrics, that's fine, but how much money should go each way? The general practice is half the money goes to the composition and half the money goes to the lyrics. But there's not really any hard and fast rules about that. You could negotiate something differently. Let's say there's 4 writers that wrote a track, and one of them just came in at the last minute and did the easy bit in the verse, and somebody else felt they'd written the great chorus. You could have a negotiation where instead of splitting everything evenly, 4 writers, 25% each, you might say this writer's going to get 66% and that writer's going to get 33%. One of the jobs the publisher has to do is to make sure that all that administration has been covered, because at the point where you wrote the song, if you guys don't agree with each other, or if you're the manager, if your authors don't agree with the other authors, what the splits are, and get it written down and make sure there's a paper trail agreeing to it. There's an old saying, where there's a hit, there's a writ. So if you don't do anything about it, at the point it becomes successful and there's a lot of money, someone's going to be telling you that you had 1% and they had 99%. So one of the jobs that a publisher has is taking care of that side of admin. You can do that as an artist or a manager for yourself. You probably should think about it. Registration, so with OSA, go and make sure that you just speak to them. Say, hey, we need to register this track. They will give you the ISWC, this code we spoke about earlier. With ISRC, with Intergram, you will get you'll get a label number for yourself, and you'll be able to issue your own ISRCs. So but as long as they fit within the codes that you've been given to use yourself. With an ISWC, you have to wait till OSA tell you what your ISWC is. They will only issue an ISWC when all of the splits between all of the writers have been agreed. They won't give out an ISWC until it's all been agreed. The ISWC mechanism is run by Suissa, which is the Swiss OSA. So OSA is part of a global umbrella organisation called CISAC, C-I-S-A-C, which is a confederation international of societies of authors and composers. They appoint the Swiss society to run the ISWC system. The database on all of this stuff isn't publicly available. So one of the things you guys might have read about in the States at the moment is Spotify. They know who they got the recording from because the record company or the distributor uploaded the recording to Spotify, but often the record company or the distributor doesn't know who owns the publishing, who's administering the publishing, who the author is, and so it comes without that information. So then Spotify are playing a lot of tracks around the world, including here, including in America, without knowing who the authors and composers are, and then maybe not having a license for it. So Spotify keep getting dragged into court over this for millions and millions of dollars. So admin is really important because companies like Spotify don't even know half the time who wrote the song. Registrations is important because that's how you're going to get paid from the OSAs. Another role that a publisher might have is banking, finance and advances. So if a publisher really believes in you, as well as saying, hey, we'll take care of your admin for you, so like, what else can they do for you? One of the things they might do is invest in you. So you might be like, we don't need to give you guys, the publishers, 20% of all our future earnings, not forever, but for the period of the publishing agreement. But maybe if you gave us some advance money, that would help us go in the recording studio, or that would help us with touring. So there's a reason to sign a publishing agreement if they're going to pay you in advance that you find useful to bankroll and cash flow your business. Another useful thing that publishers do is licensing. So with the sync, which we mentioned earlier, sync is SYNC or SYNCH, is shorthand for synchronization. So when a recording is synchronized with some pictures, some audio visual, that's a sync. So if an advertising company rings you up and says, hey, we've got this really great film about how cool banking is in Prague, we'd love your music in the background, they're asking to sync your music with the images. So the fee that you would charge, the record company that owns the John, Paul, Ringo and George bit and the master recording, they would be paid a fee for this advert, and the author via their agent, the publisher, would be paid a fee for this advert. So the reason the author might appoint a publisher is the publisher might have a better understanding of the sync negotiations and the prices. So they might be able to get you a higher price and increase the value of your deal by more than 20%. Another thing, so that's on the business side. The other side is the creative side, that sometimes publishers can help you out with creativity. So where we were talking earlier on about these big global sub-publishers that do the admin, really have it clear in your heads. If you're negotiating with a publisher, there's an admin deal, I'm too busy, I don't know all this stuff, I want someone to take care of the admin, should be a low percentage, should be like 10% charged, short deal, maybe lasts a year, 18 months. If you don't like it, you just get out. And then there's a more complicated publishing deal where they're bringing stuff to the table. They're paying you in advance, or they're saying they will go out and find these adverts or these films that might be a sync. So they'll go and pitch your music, they will develop new usage. They might develop the writers, so the authors would sign to the publishing deal. The publisher might have a good team in-house at developing writers. So how you would develop that is they would have somebody in the team who's creative, who's experienced, who would sit and talk with the author about their lyrics and say, hey, this is really good, is that a bit too dark? Hey, have you listened to this? You might find that inspiring. Might arrange writer camps and songwriter camps. That's something that OSA, and certainly the Australian, the American, and some of the Nordic collective management organisations, their equivalents of OSA, are more and more involved in. It's something that you guys can talk to about Martin in the long run. He's got too much on his plate at the moment. But also about the creative side and the developing writer camps. It's something you guys can do amongst yourselves as well. But a publisher could help you with that. Getting more usage, go out and get the syncs or go and get commissions. So a commission would be you go to as an author or their representative, the manager or the publisher, you would go to someone who uses a lot of music, like a film company, and says, hey, if you pay us a fee, we'll go and write you a specific piece of music because we've seen your projections and what your film's going to be like. You don't have anything that fits it, but we could write something towards to that. So you can sometimes be paid in advance to write a piece of music or a song that would fit somewhere. Publishers are also useful at discovering new writers and nurturing them. So be really careful with the publisher if they're offering you a deal, is what is their administration like? Are they using loads of sub-publishers? The key clauses is you want a short a deal as possible. So there's two components to the time in the deal. The first one would be, let's say you signed the publishing deal on January the 1st of this year. The term of the deal, let's say it was a 2-year deal. So it expires on December the 31st, 2019. Then there is a thing called a retention period, which means that any songs that you wrote during those 2-year periods that company then started publishing, they would probably be able to keep publishing them for another 5 years after your deal finished, after your term finished, because although they're not getting the rights to the new songs that you wrote in January 2020, they still have time to exploit the old stuff that they've been working on for a while. And when you think of things like synchronizations, going to get music used in games and things like that, it takes a long time because the advertising agency might love a song that a publisher plays them but doesn't have a project that's suitable for it at that moment. So we're going to do maybe another 10 minutes here because there's a huge information dump coming at you. But do fire in with questions. So that's broadly the role of a publisher. And although we didn't break it out, I think we've got the role of a collective management organisation. They're very much there as a not-for-profit to represent their members. They're members of the authors. You guys are authors or representatives of authors, so it's your organisation, whereas a publisher is a commercial organisation that's selling you a service.
Let's say you sell your CDs outside Germany or whatever, so you registered GEMA or some local, or it doesn't matter?
So globally,
somewhere.
OSA is in the CSAC network. There's a thing called an IPI, which is an Interested Parties Index. So with the ISWC, which is this works code, when that goes into the system from OSA here, or from PRS in the UK, or from APRA in Australia, it goes into the global CSAC system.
It's like brother and sister companies, so
They're collecting for each other.
The horrible thing about it is if you can't, as just an ordinary member or a member of the public or Spotify, you can't check it. So there's an Interested Parties Index which would give Lennon and McCartney would each be an interested party because they're the authors, their original publisher, and then they sold that on to Sony. So all of those people would have Interested Parties Index. So there isn't a number within the authors ecosystem that identifies authors. They treat the publishers with a number, they treat the authors with a number. It's a pretty rubbish system. It's way better than the ISRC system, which maybe we'll come on to later, but it's not brilliant. So don't believe that just because you had an ISWC, everything's fixed. When Spotify, somebody in America covers one of your songs, they don't know who you are, they don't know the ISWC, they upload it to Spotify, Spotify uses it, it's called Hello. Is it Hello by you? Is it Hello by Lionel Richie? Is it Hello by Eminem? Is it Hello by Adele? Nobody.
I think they just don't want to do it properly, really. Because like you do, they find out if someone plays your guitar.
Yeah.
You have like loud music, someone plays it acoustic, they find out it's you, right?
Yeah.
You got SoundHound, they can find out by singing your song, right?
So
why shouldn't like be the same for the Spotify?
So the technology.
Is that
Facebook,
also,
movies, you know, in these days the technology is far enough. Right?
It works, yeah.
The technology on, we'll go more into YouTube later on, but so we're talking again because the consumer, the fan, the audience thinks of tracks. They don't think of the composition, the lyrics, and the performance. They just think of music. So when you put music onto YouTube, YouTube is able to look at the recording and create a profile of it, a fingerprint, and then it's able to check that against every other profile, every other fingerprint of every other recording that was ever out there. And it can do a really good job of instantly recognizing, oh no, someone else uploaded this 20 years ago, or maybe 10 years ago, and nobody's listened to it. But I have it in my memory, I have it in my system. So it has this giant thing that's remembering all the recordings. And so exactly to your point, if you upload your recording and there's a guitar solo in it and some kid in New Zealand rips your guitar solo and then adds it into their recording and uploads it, YouTube will go, I know that guitar solo. And it'll match the two things. It won't say I know who owns it, but it will go, this is the same. So that's on the recording side, but not on the author side.
But usually it actually signs back to the original author if it's in the system. We had actually exactly a workshop with Andras.
So that's on the master side.
It is on the master side. So whenever the right of the recording is assigned at YouTube, they immediately sign back to the rights owner.
So the rights owner. So what happens with YouTube? They have a thing called a content management system.
Yeah, exactly.
So if there's 700 accounts worldwide, so the big TuneCore has one, Universal has one. people who YouTube trust, not because they're being smart asses and they don't like everyone or they like some people, but just because they need it to be manageable. They've allowed on trust because there is no music industry database. When YouTube are like, hey, can somebody tell us who owns all this stuff? The music industry's like. So what YouTube has done is built their own registry internally, so they've trusted a few people to tell them who owns what. At the point where Universal have uploaded your track, and then you come along later and say, I own it, there will be a dispute. So YouTube will assume Universal owns it if Universal said they own it. If somebody challenges it and says, no, no, I own that, YouTube calls a dispute resolution mechanism, and then they're like, we don't know, but we'd love you guys to sort it out. And generally it gets sorted out, particularly if there's any real money involved. So that's on the master recording side. On the author's side, the lyrics and the composition, the technology does not yet exist to do this kind of matching. It matches on the recording, but so if you imagine me singing the Beatles Yesterday in the shower this morning and recording it, YouTube wouldn't have a copy of my shower sound singing. They wouldn't have anything to match it to, so they could just go, great, this is a new recording, this guy Jake owns it.
They find
No,
out
they will
actually.
know that.
If I'm uploading it for the first time, it's me, I sang it this morning in the shower.
They find out. Like I have a video, some guys playing acoustically terribly our song, and it goes
Right,
to
so,
us.
I'm coming to that. So at the point with the recording, they don't know who it is because I'm the first person to upload it. What's starting to happen, but it's not there yet, is they have melody recognition. So they're then getting robots to listen to what I'm singing, and they're going, that sounds a little bit like Yesterday. But they don't have it there yet. They're a long way off. So on the recording side, it's unbelievable how well they can match it. I did some stuff for Radiohead where they released their own album, and we monitored it on YouTube. And what we were finding was fans immediately started remixing it. And then Tom York did a solo album called Tomorrow's Modern Boxes that he asked people to remix. And it was unbelievable how quickly the YouTube system was saying to us, this is yours. And we were listening to it, and the fans had ripped some bass part and played it backwards and put it in there. And the YouTube system was spotting stuff that we would never have spotted. So on the master side, it's brilliant. It's not yet there on the lyrics side, but it's coming. It's coming through this thing called melody recognition, which relies on me holding enough of a tune on Yesterday for them to spot that, and there being enough versions of Yesterday. And then also what they're doing is they're stripping out from voice to text to write down the lyrics, and then they're checking the lyrics. They're the only people really doing it. Facebook have hired most of YouTube's engineers because they're trying to build the following system. But what's really interesting about this is the authors community, the collective management organisations, the publishers don't have any of this technology and have not looked at it. So it's very difficult. The reason the digital companies are building this stuff is because they keep getting sued. There should be some middle ground between the two sides of how do we fix this. But just really important that assume if you wrote the song, even if you've got an ISWC for it and you registered it with OSA, not everybody's going to know when it was used. If it's the recording, particularly if it's digital, there's good ways of tracking when it was used. Different types of usage. I think we've sort of covered public performance. So public performance is Lennon and McCartney wrote the song, Martin went on stage, performed to you guys, played the song. He, or the person who sold the tickets, needs to make a payment back through OSA to pay Lennon and McCartney because he used their song, although it was his performance. If he gets recorded by a record company, that gets played on the record, on the radio station is going to pay a license. Some of it's going to go towards Intergram, some of it is going to go towards OSA, because both sides need to get paid, the master rights and the publishing rights. Mechanicals is a really old-fashioned term, is basically when people made mechanical copies, so like wax cylinders, vinyl records of Martin singing this song, the permission to make loads of copies was required, so that if a record company said, hey, we're gonna make 10,000 CDs of him singing the hits of the Beatles, he would have to get a license from a collective management organisation usually connected to OSA or part of OSA or the equivalents in other countries. The record company would have to get a license from them, a mechanical license for permission to make 10,000 copies. Or this, we can't afford that, maybe they'd do 5,000 copies. So it was a payment up front from the record company towards the authors, because it might be that they wouldn't sell any of those CDs. So the publishers and the authors liked to get paid up front because they didn't know how many times the stuff would be sold or used, and they couldn't really track that. So it was permission to manufacture. When you got wax cylinders replaced by vinyl, vinyl replaced by cassettes, cassettes replaced by CDs, CDs are digital, digital CDs replaced by download, you still had this concept of mechanical. Streaming has now replaced download, and so within streaming they have a bit that's public performance, a bit that's mechanical, and there's some other stuff in there, communication to the public and things like that. It's become a real mess. It takes you back to the beginning that it's really messy. There's not like a single usage right for the author's stuff in publishing. You need to be clear that if you wrote the song, you're the author. If you wrote it with anyone else, you need to agree the splits really fast and get that written down. You need to register it with OSA. You need to keep an eye out for when it's being used. And you have to think, who could use this music that's not just us in the band playing it tonight?
So Jake, my question for the artists from OSA, do you receive like at the end of the year or every 6 months report maybe from internet where is like, so is it correct? Like what you see, as you said, if you get the one you play in Berlin, and like they should, like it should be registered. Is it at the end of the story, or is
there is some amount what they get and what you get, and I don't understand it really.
But they don't like.
They send me some money, and I'm happy for that. But
I
don't know.
I think it fits
how much
Czech Republic, Slovakia, but if you play Germany, France.
But can you see like from Denmark, from each country how much you receive, or is it from radio, TV?
Yeah, you see how much we're from, but like usually we don't get paid, even if we play somewhere, and if it's some really small amount. But we have now the new publisher, so hopefully they'll fix it somehow.
Yeah, but there's something more with the Instagram, because they also take care about you as a performer. So if you make some video, so it's your performance, like performer, not author, but performer. So you get both income from both sides.
Yeah, you should get from both.
Yeah.
So Instagram is working better with the reports. So.
But also you as an artist are in charge of delivering the track list to the club wherever you go.
Yeah.
And then they should send the fees to OSA, and you can double check with OSA if you really want to do that, and you've never done it, but I know that's the way. And Czech clubs usually do it, or they would even ask me for that in advance, some of them.
You have to do it as a club actually. Originally, if they don't ask you, what they do is that they go on the net and just take some songs.
So if
have to
they
do
or
it as
promoter
festival.
doesn't give you the paper, you can download the paper.
I've got maybe a complicated question. I hope
Good.
it'll be useful for other people. I've been offered a contract from Cobalt for my songs, and also as a co-writer of other people's songs who are signed to major labels, which might be a clash. But the guy wants, for example, to sync my songs from my third and my fourth album. The fifth is coming up. Do I get to cherry pick? Can I offer him songs from my first and my second album? What happens to the songs I've written for the people from Warner's or from Universal artists? Like, can I then get those synced through him? Or do I have to, because obviously these artists have publishing deals with Warner, for example. And the second part is, you said I could ask for a short-term deal, but I think for sync licenses and for co-writes, they probably would ask for a longer-term deal, if not in perpetuity, right? Or is that old news? Sorry for all the
with in perpetuity, so we had these two lengths in the deal. You sign a deal for 2 years, but then once the deal's finished, the publisher still retains, they're still the publisher for that music for, let's say, 5 years or 10 years or 20 years, because that was the deal that you did with them. So if they had it in perpetuity, that would mean for life of copyright. So for till you're dead plus 70 years. If they're going to get that, then they really need to have done a great deal with you. They need to have probably paid you a lot of invest.
Right. That's my next question, but go on. Sorry.
So I wouldn't get. So what you might find a lot as well is the people who are buying music. So if we're talking about in this sync world, synchronization, putting it into games, soundtracks, videos, TV, adverts, the people who are buying that stuff aren't the publisher. So the publisher will say, hey, sign this, we'll get you some great sync deals. We're amazing, we have such a good sync department. They're pitching to users of music, music supervisors, people who supervise the music that's used in the film or the advert or the game, who may change their mind or who may have something else or the price might be wrong. So publishers can tell you they have relationships with music supervisors, but they can hardly ever guarantee you anything. So at the point where you're in a negotiation with a publisher, I would avoid expecting them to be able to deliver on anything. I've had writers who signed to a publisher and the publisher did a really good job, and you know from the reports that the publisher's giving back that they really tried and they just couldn't sell the music. They're a good publisher. They, you know, it's not everyone who's going to get used in the next Disney film. And then there's other publishers who are probably rubbish, who just got the phone call on the right time or met someone at the right party and that your track was amazing and it got used, and it's almost an accident that the publisher was involved. Or sometimes users of music will hear the stuff on YouTube and they'll figure out who the publisher is and they'll ring the publisher up and say, hey, do you represent these? And the publisher's like, no. And they're like, I think you do. Like, really? Oh yeah, we do. Why? Oh, we're going to put them in the new Spider-Man film. Great. And then they'll ring you up. Hey, been working really hard on Spider-Man for you. You owe me. So it's really hard to gauge how a publisher did a good deal. So on this thing of at the point where you are giving if they get success, what you might want to do is put a thing in that you do a short-term deal with them. So the term is like 2 years. But then if they get success, if they get you the Spider-Man film, maybe they can have the stuff for longer. Things like that. But if after 3 or 4 years they haven't done anything, it would be criminal if they could then keep your stuff forever, because somebody else might be hungrier or better connected. So I would allow them to have upside on success, but not upside just because they, you know, hey, I'm a big publisher, you're, you know, who are you? I've got all these contacts. So what? If they believe in you, they should be signing with you. If they do a good job, then that's great. When the money goes into OSA, historically, what was happening was OSA would then pay the publisher. The publisher would take off their fee. So let's say their fee is 20%. So 100 comes into OSA. OSA takes its fees off the top. Let's say that's 15%. 85 comes out. The publisher then takes its percentage off the 85, so like 17%. And then you've lost me on the maths. So then you get your share that comes from that. What now happens, because there are a number of cases, not here, in Western Europe, where the publishers were getting like 100 from the OSA equivalent and then just saying, hey, you got 10. They were cheating, is now generally the CMO, the collective management organisation, will pay, they'll get, of the 100 they get in, they'll give half straight away to the author, and they'll give half to the publisher. If the publisher is on 20%, they will keep their 20 and come back with the 30. So the money went 100, 50 direct to you, 50 to the publisher. Publisher can keep 20 of the total 100, pays 30 back to you. So a really good way of checking the money that the publisher got from OSA is you will see on the statement from OSA to yourself, you can work out what 100% was and you'll know what the publisher was getting. On the sync deal, the record company, the master rights owner, will have licensed them and you will have licensed them. Try and find some way of checking what the record company got if you can't see directly from your publisher what their deal was. There's quite simple ways. If people are fair and transparent, it's really hard in the modern age for publishers to hide money. Where most of the money is going missing is its digital usage and nobody's able to identify who it belonged to, and then they pay out based on market share. So it tends to go to the bigger companies.
And actually, one thing to add for live performances.
Thank you.
Every single time you go abroad, you can make yourself a favor. Is that you do your own set list and you send it in to OSA if you don't have a publisher, because once you did that, they're committed, they have to track that down, and then you can ask for that money. So don't wait for them to sign it.
Manager,
you don't need anything.
Nobody.
All you have to do is just to collect it like half a year or a year and go in and say like, okay, these were the gigs we were doing, these are the set lists, what's the information on that, and they have to do the job to collect for you. Otherwise they just wouldn't know.
I've got a question about that, because for example with PRS they don't give you an itemized list of payments that they make, or at least I've never found it on the website and they've never been able to give me one. So, you know, I could go through like play 175 gigs a year and then have to type every single one out to know what I'm getting. Okay, maybe the revenue I get back from that is worth it, but I don't have the time to write out 175
And then the publisher comes in. That's exactly
right.
the level when you have to have someone who's doing this job for you.
Okay.
But if you have a tour, I don't know, twice a year and you did 15 gigs, I think that's worth the money that you would gain from that.
The admin should get simplified. The tracking should get simplified. There's examples of melody recognition and oh, that's written by Lennon and McCartney. The technology should fix a lot of this administrivia stuff. At the point where it does, it's crazy that any of you guys would pay a publisher 20% for doing stuff that machines doing in an automated fashion and you're getting really good accounting. We're not there yet, but particularly the younger people in the room, you're of the generation that can disrupt publishing and sort out new business models. A problem of doing some stuff at the moment for a technology company that's trying to get a license off a major record label to use their music in an app. And we spoke to the publishers, and the publishers were like, we really have to put some of this through the collective management organisation, but they don't know what bit they have and we don't know what bit we have. So we can get all the authors to agree with us to come away from the collective management organisation to license this app, we might do that. The point of that story is not that publishers are good or the CMOs, the collective management organisations are good. There's tugs of war going on at the moment, and you've got to be really clear that publishing is a bit Wild West. So be really cautious about appointing someone to represent you for a long period of time. Do ask loads of questions. Make sure you're doing all the admin and the registrations yourself. Don't rely on the publisher. Really only appoint a publisher if you can see that they're going to add value. It's unlikely in the current market that they're going to pay you a huge advance. So I would think that added value is they're going to promise to pitch you for syncs, and they're going to maybe develop you as a writer.
I have one more question about the sync thing. So I'm pretty unsure about, like, if you're a recording artist, let's say I work in, I do now sometimes gigs for movie composers. So there's like, I'm never sure the way I should approach it. Let's say when they send me the score and I come to record it, so of course I think that's clear, they are the authors of the music. I get a certain fee we agreed on, and that's it. And I don't get any shares from the movie or anything, right? But then there are other setups, like I show up and I improvise, and that's it. And they use it for the movie. So how should I deal with that? Is this my proper composition? Should I get cut?
Depends what your budget is for a lawyer. So it's horrible. So at the point where you and I are sat down and we're writing a song, and I barely do anything, I'm playing with my phone, and then at the end I'm like, great, that's good, isn't it? 50-50. It's a negotiation. So try and agree the stuff before you go in. With the improvisation example, there's some very famous court cases in history where I'm thinking it's particularly of a UK one. The track's not that famous, but it was I think it was a US #1. A band called the Bluebells had a song called Young at Heart, and the violin player at the start did this really good intro that's him improvising. The violin player is now famous, Bobby Valentino, through the legal system. And he sued the band for a piece of the ownership of the songs. And this stuff goes on all the time. This is with Pharrell being sued by the Marvin Gaye estate to saying that's too close a copy to our stuff, and that's still going through the courts. It keeps getting decided, and then it's gone back again.
Really?
Yeah.
Why?
So because it's a grey area, because it does ultimately, it comes down to a musicologist, an expert in the court, saying to the jury or the judge, her improvisation was brilliant on this, and it comes to the people who ask you to do the improvisation saying, bullshit, she's just playing what any good musician would have played based on the piece that went before. A friend of mine, Steve Norman, is the saxophone player in Spandau Ballet. They were a big band in the 80s. They had this track called True that was a global massive hit. They ended up in a big court case because one of the band, there were 5 of them, all school friends, 2 of them were twins. One of the twins wrote all the songs. While they were a band performing, they split all the money. This is a really useful thing. They just had this informality of Gary the writer was like, hey, we're all in it together, we're all in a band, I'll share all the money that comes in from everything, included the publishing money. When the band split up, he was like, okay, you guys are no longer out there promoting this stuff, I'll take back the publishing money. His twin brother sided with him, and the other 3 ended up in court fighting him, and they got caught up on fighting with loads of other things as well. The judge said to the saxophone player, it is clear from the musicologists and all the expert witnesses that we've heard that the saxophone break in True is amazing and unique and is not suggested by anything that the original author and the lyricist had done. Therefore, I believe that you are the author. However, you've bought this case tangled up with all this other stuff, and on bulk, if you just bought that, you'd have won, but you've bought it with a load of other things and you've got to lose because of the other things. So it ends up in court. And so try and get a manager or a representative or someone to agree all these things at the point. With the film thing, where you're doing improvisations, you probably don't have a hope in hell because they'll just take the work elsewhere. I'm not telling you should suffer that and do it. It's up to you whether you compromise to develop and get fees, but it's a horrible thing.
Sometimes it's smart to do a deal when you sign up, like, I don't know, 10% of the income that will come in the future. Maybe they cannot pay you, like, you know, like they don't have much money, but then you say, okay, I can take a smaller fee, but I want author rights on, like, if film earns, like, and then you know,
I'm looking for like a friendly agreement on like really like involving like lawyers and you know going
Yeah.
to court.
Hard.
Like you know normal like human to human type of agreement. So I was wondering what's fair from my side to ask.
As a percentage of the song, I mean, we're talking about copyright, we're talking about who owns this intellectual property, this work. So it's not really about the fees and the money, that will all come, because if you own a third of the song, then you get a third of the money every time the song's used. A problem that you have in film, so with a record company, the band, John Paul, Ringo and George make a version of this song, it goes out, it's a hit, there's structures of how you pay the authors. The authors are completely independent people, let's say it was B.B. King or someone like that. It's really scattered the music industry. With the film industry, it's very vertical. So by that I mean that the producer of the film has to own all of the rights because they don't want to get sued by the time you turn up to the theatre in Poland and you say, you don't have the rights to play my music and you're playing it in this stupid film. So films, they will try and own all of the rights, even when I manage a composer who does a lot of stuff for film, and you end up generally giving all the rights into the film company and their publisher. So that might be an angle for them. They might be less worried about paying you, more worried about having a non-exclusive publishing agreement so that the piece that you owned of the song, they had all rights to use it in all media forever in the film. You would then have the rights to go off and make a record and stuff like that because they'd think that was irrelevant. They'd laugh that you'd even think there was money in the music industry. They're just like, they need all film rights. I don't want to eat too far into the rest of the day because there's so much to cover. This is the most boring topic that we're going to cover. It's the one that is the most in need of reform, and it's the one where my experience of artists will just sign a publishing agreement and then they go home to mum and dad who are like, hey, how's it going? How's this band? Why don't you get a proper job? You could have become a lawyer. What are you doing? You're like, Mum, it's all right. I signed a publishing agreement. Oh, that's brilliant. And you go and tell your mates, yeah, I'm no longer a loser. I've signed a publishing agreement. Publishing agreements are really fucking easy to come by. The hard one to get is a live agent. Record labels are even a bit less hard, but they're harder than publishing because they're generally going to put money in. You guys be really careful about signing publishing agreements. If you register stuff properly with OSA, there's no rush on the publishing agreement. What's underdeveloped in Central and Eastern Europe that's massively developed in the States is sync agents, people who will not take your publishing rights, they will just act as an agent just for the synchronization rights for your song. So they will go to the local advertising companies, they'll have friends in Germany, they will pitch the films in Germany. What you generally want, rather than a global publishing deal, is you want a sync agent who will go and get you synchronizations. Find within your community someone who's good at talking to people, someone who's interested in that stuff, and develop amongst yourselves local sync agents and communications with the games makers here, the film companies, the advertising agents. Should we have a break, do you think?
Yeah.